Blood and industrial pine cleaner smell exactly the same when they dry on linoleum. Most species don't know that. Most species think a frontier colony school is a soft target, ripe for the taking. When the Vrel strike team blew the airlocks on New Providence Elementary, they expected screaming children and terrified, helpless teachers. They didn't expect the hunched, gray-haired man in the faded blue jumpsuit pushing a mop bucket. They didn't know humanity's deadliest veterans don't retire. They just take out the trash. Gum under a desk is a problem that requires patience, a rigid putty knife, and a profound sense of resignation. Arthur scraped at the hardened pink mass clinging to the underside of a plastic chair in room 104, his breath whistling softly through a nose that had been broken 3 times before he turned 20. The room smelled of crayons, sweat, and the sharp tang of the citrus spray he used to wipe down the whiteboards. His knees popped like dry kindling as he stood up. Arthur rubbed his left thigh, right where the synth muscle met the scarred remnants of his organic flesh. Rain lashed against the heavy polycarbonate windows of the school. New Providence was a grey, wet world, but it was quiet. Quiet was all Arthur had asked for when the Terran Coalition handed him his discharge papers, a modest pension and a Class 4 custodial placement. He tossed the dried gum into his yellow plastic trash barrel and gripped the handle of his mop cart. The front left wheels squeaked. It always squeaked. Squeak, thump, squeak, thump. The rhythmic annoyance echoed down the deserted C-block hallway. It was 3rd period. History, maybe, or math. Arthur didn't keep track of the curriculum. He just kept the floors clean. He paused near the cafeteria doors, leaning his weight against the cart. The fluorescent lights overhead hummed a low, steady note. He closed his eyes. For a fraction of a second, the hum sounded like the idling drive of a dropship. His heart kicked against his ribs. He forced his eyes open, swallowing down the dry lump in his throat. It was just a light bulb, just a failing ballast in a civilian school. He wasn't on the burning plains of Orion 4 anymore. Mr. Arthur? Arthur blinked, pulling his focus down. A little boy, maybe 8 years old, stood outside the boys' lavatory holding a hall pass. Billy, messy blonde hair, untied shoelaces, permanent smear of dirt on his left cheek. "Paper towels are out again, Billy?" Arthur asked. His voice was a gravelly rasp, like tires on a dirt road. "Yes, sir, and somebody dropped a whole juice box by the sinks." "Appreciate the intel." Arthur nodded, reaching into his cart for a fresh stack of recycled paper towels. "Get back to class. Hallways are getting chilly." Billy grinned, missing a front tooth, and scampered off. Arthur watched him go, feeling a heavy, dull ache in his chest. It wasn't sentimentality. Arthur was too tired for sentimentality. It was the terrifying fragility of it all. 300 soft, loud, messy human children housed inside a dome on a planet 50 light-years from Earth. Then the atmospheric stabilizers cut out. It wasn't a slow fade. It was a sudden, violent cessation of the ambient white noise that kept the colony sane. The silence that followed was heavy, pressing against Arthur's eardrums. A second later, the pressure dropped. Arthur's jaw cracked as his ears popped. He froze, his hands previously relaxed around the mop handle, locked into a white-knuckled grip. Thud. It came from the main airlock, 3 corridors away, a deep, resonant vibration that traveled through the floorboards and straight up the titanium rods in Arthur's legs. He knew that vibration. It wasn't a weather anomaly. It wasn't a systems failure. That was a localized shaped charge, directional breaching explosive. The lockdown sirens began to wail, a shrill, piercing shriek that tore through the quiet. Red emergency strobes activated, bathing the brightly painted hallway in pulses of blood-red light. Arthur didn't move. He stood perfectly still beside his yellow cart, closing his eyes. A wave of profound, nauseating exhaustion washed over him. He hated this. He hated the sirens. He hated the vibration in the floor. And above all, he hated the fact that his body was already reacting. His breathing slowed. His heart rate dropped. The dull ache in his knee vanished, flooded out by a massive, involuntary dump of adrenaline into his system. Teachers began opening their doors. Voices echoed, frantic and thin. "Line up! Quickly away from the windows!" A woman yelled down the hall. Arthur opened his eyes. He grabbed the handle of his mop cart and shoved it hard against the wall, out of the way. He didn't run. Running attracted attention. Running wasted oxygen. He walked with a swift, purposeful stride toward Maintenance Bay 4, slipping into the shadows as the red strobe spun. Maintenance Bay 4 was located at the structural junction between the primary education wing and the gymnasium. It was a windowless concrete room smelling heavily of bleach, floor wax, and old dust. Arthur slipped inside, locking the heavy steel door behind him with a loud metallic clack. He stood in the dark for a moment, listening. Through the thick walls, he heard the screaming start. It was faint at first, then abruptly louder, plasteel shattering, the distinct tearing sizzle of plasma fire. He didn't feel heroic. He felt sick to his stomach. He coughed, a dry, racking sound, and spat onto the concrete floor. Arthur walked past the shelves of industrial solvents, past the stacks of toilet paper and the rows of heavy-duty mops. At the very back of the room sat a massive grey circuit breaker box, covered in warning labels. He pressed his thumb against a rusted, seemingly decorative screw on the side of the panel. A microscopic laser scanned his print, read his pulse, and analyzed the sweat on his skin to confirm his DNA. Click. The entire breaker panel swung outward on hidden hinges, revealing a cavity set deep into the reinforced concrete of the station's superstructure. Cool, dry air spilled out of the alcove, smelling of gun oil and ozone. Arthur reached in. He didn't grab a shining suit of armor. There was nothing glorious in the dark space. He pulled out a heavy, matte black ballistic vest. It was worn, frayed at the edges, bearing the faded, stenciled emblem of the Terran Coalition Shock Infantry. He slipped it over his head, wincing as the ceramic trauma plates pulled at his bad shoulder. He strapped it tight across his ribs. Next came the weapon, a Mark 7 kinetic carbine, suppressed, chambered in dense tungsten penetrator rounds. It was a heavy, ugly piece of machinery designed for one purpose, to violently transfer kinetic energy into hostile biology. He checked the action. The bolt slid back with a smooth, oiled snick. He loaded a magazine, the sharp slap of metal on metal echoing in the small room. Arthur reached over to the small medical kit in the door of the cache. He popped the seal on a bottle of over-the-counter ibuprofen and dry-swallowed 3 of them. His hands were shaking. He looked down at them, watching the slight tremor in his scarred fingers. "Get it together, old man," he whispered to the empty room. He wasn't afraid to die. He had made peace with death decades ago on a mud-soaked rock near the Perseus Arm. He was shaking because his central nervous system was violently overriding years of civilian conditioning. The beast he had buried under floor wax and elementary school schedules was clawing its way out, and the transition hurt. He keyed a small earpiece from the cache and jammed it into his left ear. He tuned it to the colony's emergency frequency. Static hissed, followed by frantic, broken voices. "Breach at the main atrium! God, they're giant! I need police down here now! They have weapons! They're shooting the—" The voice cut off into a wet, gurgling static. Arthur recognized the description. Giant, plural, the smell of plasma. Vrel, a raiding party. The Vrel were a nomadic, chitinous species that viewed frontier colonies as easy pickings for slaves and resources. They didn't understand the concept of non-combatants. To a Vrel, if it breathed, it was meat. Arthur strapped a heavy, serrated combat knife to his thigh, threw a bandolier of spare magazines over his shoulder, and pulled his grey custodial cap down low over his eyes. He took one last look around the maintenance closet. The mop bucket sat in the corner, innocuous and yellow. He unlatched the heavy steel door of the bay and pushed it open an inch. Smoke rolled through the crack, thick and acrid. The smell of burning plastic and charred meat hit his nose, a putrid combination that tasted like copper on his tongue. The hallway of C-block, brightly painted with primary colors and paper cutouts of farm animals, was now an absolute nightmare. Arthur stepped out. The janitor was gone. The smoke hovered at waist height, dragged through the corridors by the failing ventilation system. Arthur moved in a low crouch, his boots making absolutely no sound on the linoleum he had buffed just yesterday. His joints ached with every step, but he ignored the pain. Pain was just data. He hugged the right wall, scanning over the sights of the heavy carbine. The red emergency strobes painted the smoke in horrific flashing silhouettes. He heard them before he saw them, a rapid clicking chatter, like massive typewriters clashing together, accompanied by the heavy, dragging scrape of clawed feet. Arthur slipped into the alcove of a drinking fountain, pressing his back against the cool ceramic tile. He slowed his breathing. In, out, shallow, silent. 2 Vrel warriors rounded the corner from the cafeteria. They were towering nightmares of iridescent black carapace and sharp angles, standing nearly 8 feet tall. They carried heavy plasma repeaters in their primary limbs, their secondary arms twitching with nervous predatory energy. Their mandibles clicked rapidly as they communicated, scanning the doors. They were looking for stragglers. They were looking for kids. Arthur felt a cold, utterly detached rage settle over him. It wasn't the fiery anger of a hero. It was the icy, calculated fury of an exterminator finding roaches in his kitchen. He stepped out of the alcove, leveling the carbine. The lead Vrel snapped its angular head toward him, its compound eyes catching the red strobe light. It didn't have time to raise its weapon. Arthur pulled the trigger. The suppressed carbine coughed. Thwip, 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 a violent mechanical spit. 3 heavy tungsten rounds tore through the hallway at supersonic speeds. The first round shattered the Vrel's plasma repeater, exploding the weapon in its claws. The second and third rounds hands punched clean through the creature's chest carapace. The impact sounded like a sledgehammer hitting a hollow wooden door. Viscous, pale green blood sprayed across the walls, splattering over a bulletin board displaying third-grade finger paintings. The massive alien collapsed backward, its limbs thrashing wildly as its central nervous system short-circuited. The second Vrel shrieked, a deafening metallic sound that vibrated in Arthur's teeth. It lunged forward, moving with terrifying speed, clearing the distance between them in 3 massive strides. It swung a jagged, bladed limb down toward Arthur's head. Arthur didn't try to block it. He wasn't strong enough anymore. He dropped entirely, letting his bad knee give way, sliding hard across the waxed floor. The blade sheared the air where his neck had been a fraction of a second earlier, slicing into the drywall. From his back, looking up into the creature's underbelly, Arthur shoved the barrel of the carbine upward and emptied half the magazine. The heavy recoil beat against his shoulder, jarring his spine. The tungsten rounds ripped upward through the softer joints of the Vrel's armor. The alien froze, a shudder rippling through its massive frame, before it crashed down heavily onto the floor, mere inches from Arthur's boots. The smell of its blood was horrific, like rotting fish and battery acid. Arthur lay there for a second, gasping for air. The ceiling spun slightly. The sheer physical exertion of the 4-second firefight left him drained. He hated getting old. He forced himself to roll over, using the wall to pull his aching body upright. He ejected the half-empty magazine, letting it clatter to the floor, and slammed a fresh one home. He checked the corridor, empty for now. From the classroom directly to his left, room 104, where he had just scraped the gum, he heard a muffled sob. Arthur stepped over the twitching legs of the dead Vrel and approached the door. It was locked, but the reinforced glass panel in the door was spiderwebbed from a stray plasma shot. He pressed his face near the glass. Inside, huddled in the dark corner behind the teacher's desk, were a dozen children. Ms. Gable, a young woman barely out of university, was crouched over them, her arms spread wide as if her soft sweater could stop alien munitions. She was crying silently, her eyes wide with absolute terror. Arthur tapped the glass twice with his knuckle. Ms. Gable flinched, looking up. When she saw the blood-spattered, heavily armed figure in the window, she let out a choked gasp, pulling the kids tighter. Then she recognized the faded blue custodial cap. She recognized the exhausted, deeply lined face beneath it. Arthur didn't smile. He didn't offer a thumbs up. He simply pointed 2 fingers at his own eyes and then pointed down at the floor, the universal military signal for stay down and stay quiet. Ms. Gable nodded frantically, tears spilling over her cheeks. She clamped a hand over Billy's mouth as the little boy started to whimper. Arthur turned his back to the door, facing the long, smoke-filled corridor leading to the main atrium. If they wanted the kids, they had to come through him. He checked the action on his carbine one more time, the metallic click grounding him in the terrible reality of the present. He began to walk down the hall, stepping squarely in the center of the corridor. The left wheel of his mop cart was sitting abandoned near the wall. As he passed it, he gave it a slight shove with his boot. Squeak. The sound was tiny, pathetic against the distant roar of the invasion. Arthur rolled his shoulders, feeling the heavy trauma plates settle into place. There was a mess in the atrium, and it was time to go to work. Water rained from the ceiling. The fire suppression system in the B-wing corridor finally detected the extreme heat of the plasma burns and activated, dumping thousands of gallons of stagnant, rust-tinted water onto the linoleum. It hit the superheated slag of the ruined walls and instantly vaporized into thick, choking steam. Arthur hated the smell. It was a putrid mix of old pipes, scorched synthetic insulation, and wet dust. He leaned heavily against a row of dented blue lockers, letting the cold water plaster his gray hair to his skull. His lungs burned with a dull, persistent ache. Every breath tasted like copper and old coffee. His boots slipped slightly on the wet floor. He glanced down. The water pooling around his feet was swirling with the pale green blood of the Vrel he had left in the hallway. It looked like antifreeze. Arthur gritted his teeth, shifting his weight off his bad leg. The synthetic muscle fibers in his left thigh were spasming, a rhythmic twitch that sent sharp jolts of pain directly into his lower spine. He swallowed hard, trying to keep his heart rate down. At 62, his body was a stubborn machine held together by surgical steel and spite, but it was currently burning through its limited reserves of adrenaline at a terrifying pace. He wiped the dirty water from his eyes with a shaking, scarred hand. The main atrium was 30 yards ahead. The heavy double doors had been blown completely off their tracks, leaving jagged, blackened stumps of metal protruding from the drywall. Through the opening, the red emergency strobes painted the swirling steam in erratic, bloody flashes. Arthur moved. He kept his back pressed against the lockers, his footsteps silent beneath the heavy, drumming hiss of the sprinklers. He didn't feel like a phantom. He felt like an old man carrying too much weight, his knees popping with every slow, deliberate crouch. He reached the edge of the blown-out doorway and risked a quick glance around the torn metal frame. The atrium was a disaster. It was a massive, two-story open space, usually filled with natural light, and the chaotic noise of hundreds of students moving between periods. Now it was a slaughterhouse. The large glass dome overhead was completely shattered, allowing the cold, grey rain of New Providence to pour inside, mixing with the sprinkler water on the decorative tile floor. The massive bronze statue of the colony's founder lay toppled, its head melted off by a heavy plasma cannon. 4 Vrel warriors occupied the space. They were massive, heavily armored variants, their iridescent black chitin slick with the rain. They moved with a jerky, terrifying efficiency, their 4 legs clicking sharply against the wet tiles. 2 of them were guarding the main entrance, their heavy plasma repeaters scanning the empty courtyard outside. The other 2 were systematically tearing open the locked doors of the administrative offices lining the far wall. They weren't just securing the building. They were hunting for the colony's central network hub to disable external comms. Arthur pressed his back against the wall, breathing through his mouth to minimize the sound. 4 heavies, open ground, no cover between the hallway and the center of the room. It was a tactical nightmare. If he stepped out, they would cut him in half before he cleared his first target. He looked down at his yellow mop cart, abandoned just inside the hallway. A cynical, bitter chuckle rattled in his chest. He reached into one of the deep side pockets of his tactical vest and pulled out a standard-issue fragmentation grenade. He hadn't thrown one of these in 20 years. The metal felt heavy, cold, and profoundly ugly in his palm. He didn't pull the pin yet. He unclipped a heavy, high-tension bungee cord from the side of his mop cart, the one he used to strap down the bulky bags of recycled paper. He tied one end of the cord securely to the handle of the yellow cart, wrapping it 3 times and knotting it tight. He tied the other end to the heavy metal handle of the blown-out doorframe. Arthur pulled the pin on the grenade, keeping the spoon depressed with his thumb. He wedged the explosive tightly between the mop wringer and the side of the plastic bucket, making sure the spoon was held in place by the tension of the plastic. He took a deep breath, his chest tight. He kicked the mop cart hard. The yellow plastic cart rolled out into the open atrium, its front left wheel squeaking aggressively over the sound of the rain. Squeak, thump, squeak, thump. All 4 Vrel snapped their terrifying angular heads toward the sound. They saw a yellow cart rolling slowly across the wet tiles. The lead warrior emitted a sharp, metallic click of confusion, raising its heavy weapon toward the innocuous object. The cart rolled 10 feet, reached the end of the bungee cord, and snapped to a violent halt. The sudden jerk tipped the bucket. The grenade dislodged. The spoon flew off with a sharp, metallic ping. Arthur clamped his hands over his ears and opened his mouth, turning his face away from the doorway. 3 seconds later, the atrium erupted. The fragmentation grenade detonated with a deafening, concussive roar that shattered what little glass remained in the window frames. A massive shockwave of expanding gas and jagged shrapnel tore through the open space. The blast instantly shredded the 2 Vrel nearest the administration offices, their heavy armor completely failing against the hypervelocity fragments. Green blood and chunks of black chitin painted the ruined walls. Arthur didn't wait for the smoke to clear. He spun around the doorframe, bringing the heavy kinetic carbine up to his shoulder. Dust and debris rained down on him, getting into his eyes, but he kept both eyes open, fighting the urge to blink. The 2 Vrel near the entrance were disoriented, their sensitive auditory receptors overwhelmed by the blast. One was missing its lower left limb, staggering wildly and shrieking a horrific, high-pitched wail. Arthur dropped to one knee, the hard impact sending a blinding flash of pain through his joint. He ignored it. He leveled the heavy weapon and squeezed the trigger. Thwip, thwip, thwip. The suppressed carbine bucked against his collarbone. 3 heavy tungsten rounds punched through the shrieking Vrel's upper thorax. The alien collapsed instantly, dropping like a puppet with cut strings, its massive body splashing hard into the pooling water. The final Vrel recovered fast. It spun toward Arthur, its mandibles wide, a horrifying hiss escaping its throat. It raised its plasma repeater, the magnetic coils glowing a blinding, lethal blue. Arthur aimed for center mass and pulled the trigger. Click, a jam, a completely random, inexcusable mechanical failure, a faulty primer, a slightly bent casing, a speck of dirt. The universe's sick joke. Arthur felt his stomach drop. There was no time to clear the action. There was no time to draw his sidearm. The blue glow of the plasma weapon intensified, illuminating the Vrel's compound eyes. Arthur threw himself to the left, diving hard onto the wet, hard tiles, just as a bolt of superheated plasma tore through the space where his chest had been. The heat of the blast scorched his cheek, singeing his eyebrows and filling his nose with the smell of burning hair. The plasma struck the metal lockers behind him, blowing a massive molten crater in the wall. Arthur hit the floor hard, knocking the wind out of his lungs. He slid across the wet tiles, dropping the useless carbine. The Vrel shrieked in triumph, taking heavy, thudding steps toward him, aiming the glowing weapon downward for the execution shot. Arthur didn't panic. Panic was for civilians. He drew the heavy, serrated combat knife from his thigh sheath. As the massive alien loomed over him, its weapon tracking his prone form, Arthur kicked out with his good leg. He drove the steel toe of his work boot directly into the ruined, shrapnel-torn knee joint of the Vrel's front leg. The creature let out a mechanical gargle of pain as its leg buckled. It stumbled forward, its massive weight pulling it down. Arthur rolled entirely, using the momentum to thrust himself upward. He drove the 8-inch blade of the combat knife straight up, burying it under the Vrel's armored chin, sliding the steel directly into the soft, unprotected tissue of its throat. He twisted the blade violently and pulled it outward. Hot, foul-smelling green blood gushed over Arthur's hands and forearms. The alien thrashed wildly, its mandibles snapping inches from Arthur's face. Arthur held onto the knife handle with both hands, pinning the creature to the floor as it bled out. It took 30 agonizing seconds of violent struggle before the massive alien finally went limp, its compound eyes dimming. Arthur collapsed onto his back beside the dead creature, gasping for air. His arms were shaking uncontrollably. His face was covered in cold water and alien blood. He closed his eyes, listening to the rain falling through the shattered dome. He wheezed, his voice cracking. Hate Mondays. Silence was a terrifying thing. When the shooting stopped, the only sounds left were the dripping of water and the ragged, shallow rasp of Arthur's own breathing. He forced himself to sit up. His left shoulder was throbbing, a deep, dull ache that warned of torn cartilage. He looked at his hands. They were stained a sick, pale green, the alien blood already beginning to congeal and stink like sulfur. He grabbed the abandoned carbine from the floor, racked the bolt violently, and watched the deformed brass casing eject onto the tiles. He let the bolt slam home, chambering a fresh round. Good to go. He pushed himself to his feet, leaning heavily on the weapon like a crutch until his dizzy spell passed. The administration wing was dead ahead. He needed to reach the principal's office, not for the files, not for the intercom, but for the heavy red button hardwired under Principal David's massive oak desk, the planetary distress beacon. It bypassed the school's civilian network and broadcast an encrypted, high-burst signal directly to the Terran Coalition orbital relay. It was the only way to get a heavy response team down to the surface before the Vrel started cracking the reinforced doors of the classrooms. Arthur stepped over the mutilated bodies of the aliens, his boots leaving bloody, wet prints on the carpeted floor of the main office lobby. The reception desk was destroyed. The heavy glass partitions were shattered, carpeting the floor in millions of sharp, glittering cubes. Files were scattered everywhere, floating in small puddles of rainwater. It was profoundly depressing. These were children's lives. Report cards, medical forms, disciplinary slips, trampled under the heavy, clawed feet of monsters. He kicked open the frosted glass door to the principal's office. The room was dark. The power had completely failed in this sector, leaving only the weak, grey light filtering through the rain-streaked window behind the desk. The room smelled of expensive cologne, old paper, and the metallic tang of ozone. Arthur stepped inside, sweeping the corners with the barrel of his carbine. Clear. He moved quickly around the large oak desk, dropping to one knee. He ignored the sharp pain and reached under the heavy wooden lip. His fingers brushed against the smooth metal housing of the beacon. He found the protective plastic cover, flipped it open, and slammed his thumb onto the heavy button. Nothing happened. No hum, no flashing confirmation light, no subtle vibration of a localized transmitter engaging. Arthur frowned. He pressed it again, harder. Still nothing. He pulled a small tactical flashlight from his vest and clicked it on, shining the beam under the desk. The thick bundle of fiber-optic cables leading from the back of the button housing had been cleanly severed. The ends were scorched and melted, fused together by a pinpoint thermal cutter. Arthur felt a cold chill run down his spine. The Vrel were brutal, but they weren't stupid. They had cut the hard lines before they started the slaughter. They had isolated the building. "Damn it," Arthur whispered, his voice hoarse. He stood up, turning off the flashlight to conserve his tactical advantage in the dark. He needed a plan. If the physical lines were cut, the only way to send a signal was to access the roof array directly, and that meant going through the gymnasium. Before he could take a step toward the door, he heard a sound. It was faint but distinct, a soft, rhythmic clicking. It wasn't coming from the hallway. It was coming from above him. Arthur slowly raised his head. The ceiling tiles in the principal's office were the cheap, drop-in, acoustic kind. One of them, right above the center of the room was missing, pushed aside into the dark cavity of the ventilation shaft. A drop of thick, green fluid fell from the darkness, splattering against the leather surface of the principal's chair. Arthur didn't hesitate. He threw himself backward, diving behind the solid oak desk just as the ceiling completely collapsed. A Vrel stalker dropped into the room. It was smaller than the warriors in the atrium, sleeker, its armor lacking the heavy plating but making up for it in terrifying agility. It carried two curved, serrated blades, attached directly to its primary forelimbs. It landed without a sound, absorbing the impact perfectly, its compound eyes locking onto the space where Arthur had stood a fraction of a second before. The alien clicked rapidly, realizing its prey had moved. It scrambled over the desk with horrifying speed, its sharp claws tearing deep gouges into the polished wood. Arthur was flat on his back. As the stalker crested the desk, looming over him like a spider, Arthur brought his boots up. He kicked the heavy oak desk as hard as he physically could. The massive piece of furniture shifted backward, slamming into the alien's midsection and momentarily pinning it against the heavy bookshelf behind it. The creature shrieked, a high-pitched, furious sound, and slashed blindly downward with its serrated blade. The razor-sharp edge caught Arthur's left shoulder, slicing cleanly through the thick fabric of the tactical vest and biting deep into his flesh. Arthur roared in pain, a harsh, guttural sound. The wound felt like a line of liquid fire running down his collarbone. His left arm went instantly numb, the heavy carbine slipping from his grasp. The alien shoved the desk away, freeing itself, and prepared to strike a lethal blow. Arthur scrambled backward on his good arm and legs, his boots slipping on the blood-slick carpet. He crashed into a metal filing cabinet, trapping himself in the corner. The Vrel stalker advanced, its mandibles parting to reveal rows of needle-like teeth, a low hiss escaping its throat. Arthur couldn't lift his left arm. His gun was on the floor, out of reach. He was bleeding heavily, the warm blood soaking his shirt. He looked up at the terrifying alien, feeling the cold, dark edges of exhaustion creeping into his peripheral vision. He was old, he was tired, but he wasn't done. Arthur's right hand shot out, grabbing a heavy, solid brass nameplate off the floor. It read David Harrison, Principal. He didn't throw it. He gripped it tightly in his fist, adding 2 pounds of solid metal to his punch. As the Vrel stalker lunged, bringing its blades down for the kill, Arthur pivoted his hips. He channeled every ounce of remaining strength, every bit of kinetic force his augmented leg could generate, and swung his right arm in a brutal, desperate uppercut. The solid brass nameplate connected perfectly with the underside of the Vrel's jaw, right where the heavy chitin met the softer tissue of the neck. The sickening crack of fracturing bone echoed in the small office. The sheer force of the blow lifted the alien off its feet. Its head snapped backward at an unnatural angle. It crashed heavily into the shattered window frame, its limbs thrashing wildly for a few seconds before going completely, permanently still. Arthur sat against the filing cabinet, his chest heaving, his breath coming in ragged, painful gasps. He dropped the dented brass nameplate onto the ruined carpet. His left shoulder was bleeding badly, a steady red stain spreading across the grey fabric of his jumpsuit. He closed his eyes, resting his head against the cold metal of the cabinet. The pain was blinding, radiating from his shoulder down to his fingertips. He felt sick, cold sweat breaking out across his forehead. He needed a tourniquet. He needed painkillers. He needed a goddamn nap. But he opened his eyes. He forced himself to look at the dead alien, then at the severed comm wires under the desk. Nobody was coming. The cavalry wasn't on its way. The planetary defense forces didn't even know the school was under attack. It was just him, a building full of terrified kids, and a raiding party of hostile aliens who didn't know when to quit. Arthur reached over with his good hand, grabbed the edge of the desk, and dragged himself to his feet. He swayed dangerously, the room spinning, but he locked his synthetic knee and forced himself upright. He grabbed his carbine from the floor, checking the safety with bloody fingers. He ripped a long strip of fabric from the hem of his ruined jumpsuit and tied it tightly around his bleeding shoulder, pulling it taut with his teeth. The pain was agonizing, but it slowed the bleeding. He walked out of the principal's office, leaving bloody footprints on the shattered glass. He looked down the dark, ruined hallway leading toward the gymnasium. The roof access was that way. The manual transmission dish was that way. "All right," Arthur rasped, spitting a wad of bloody saliva onto the floor. "Let's go fix the antenna." He racked the bolt of the carbine. He didn't walk with the purposeful stride of a soldier anymore. He limped. He dragged his bad leg. He bled. But he didn't stop. He was the janitor. There was a mess to clean up, and he wasn't clocking out until the job was done. Blood loss makes the world feel strangely soft. Arthur noticed it as he dragged his bad leg past the display cases in the main corridor. The sharp edges of the shattered trophies, the jagged metal of the torn lockers, they all looked a little blurry, a little less real. His left arm hung completely useless at his side. The crude cloth tourniquet soaked a heavy, dark crimson. Every heartbeat pushed a fresh wave of dull, agonizing pressure against his collarbone. He leaned his right shoulder against the cinderblock wall, leaving a smeared trail of sweat and dirt as he moved. The air in the D-wing was suffocating. The ventilation system had completely died, leaving the heavy scent of ozone, burning plastic, and ruptured plumbing suspended in the dark. It smelled like the interior of a gutted transport ship. Arthur swallowed dryly. His tongue felt like sandpaper. He needed water. He needed a combat medic with a trauma kit and a very large syringe of synthetic morphine. Instead, he had half a magazine of tungsten rounds and a building full of giant predatory insects. He paused at the intersection of the science labs. The heavy fire doors had engaged, dropping thick slabs of reinforced plasteel across the corridor. The Vrel hadn't bothered to cut through them. They had simply bypassed this section, leaving the structural seals intact. Arthur stared at the heavy manual override lever next to the door. It was designed to be pulled with two hands in an emergency. Arthur wedged the stock of his carbine beneath his right armpit. He reached up with his good hand, grabbing the cold metal lever. He pulled. It didn't budge. The magnetic locks were jammed, likely warped by the concussive force of the grenade in the atrium. He closed his eyes. A wave of profound, acidic bitterness washed over him. He wasn't supposed to be doing this. He was supposed to be buffing the floors in the cafeteria. He took a ragged breath, tasting copper. He planted his good boot against the wall for leverage, wrapped his bleeding, slippery fingers around the handle, and threw his entire body weight backward. Metal shrieked. The heavy locking mechanism groaned under the sudden, violent torque. Fire flared in his shattered shoulder, a blinding, white-hot spike that forced a strangled, pathetic gasp from his lungs. He kept pulling. Tendons popped in his neck. The lever snapped downward with a violent crack. The heavy plasteel doors hissed, sliding apart just enough to let a man slip through. Arthur collapsed onto his knees. The concrete floor felt wonderfully cool against his cheek. He stayed there for 10 seconds, counting the erratic, fluttering beats of his heart. 1, 2, 3, he coughed, spitting a string of bloody saliva onto the linoleum. Get up! He dragged himself through the narrow gap. The corridor leading to the gymnasium was completely dark, save for a single, flickering emergency bulb at the far end. The silence here was oppressive. It wasn't the empty silence of a weekend school. It was the heavy, pregnant silence of a hunting ground. Arthur moved slowly, his boots scuffing the floor. He kept the carbine raised, his right arm trembling with the effort of supporting the weapon one-handed. He passed the music room. The heavy acoustic doors were dented inward, covered in deep, parallel gouges from Vrel claws. They hadn't breached it. The structural reinforcement of the soundproofing had held. Good. Kids were probably in there. Quiet. He reached the double doors of the gymnasium. They were blown wide open. Arthur pressed his back against the cool brick of the hallway, peering around the shattered doorframe. The gymnasium was massive, a cavernous dome of polished hardwood and retracted bleachers. The emergency lighting cast long, twisted shadows across the basketball court. The smell hit him instantly. It was a dense, metallic stench, alien sweat, ruptured plasma coils, and the unmistakable sweet odor of roasted meat. 3 Vrel warriors were inside. They weren't patrolling, they were working. They had hauled a massive, bulky device into the center of the hardwood court. It looked like a jagged metallic parasite covered in pulsing optical cables and heavy magnetic clamps. They were physically tearing into the reinforced floorboards, exposing the school's primary structural power conduits. They were trying to splice their device directly into the colony's grid. Arthur recognized the equipment. It was a heavy signal jammer. The Vrel weren't just raiding, they were setting up a localized blackout zone. If they powered that machine, it wouldn't matter if Arthur reached the roof array. The signal wouldn't punch through the atmospheric distortion. He had to break it. He had to break them. Arthur looked down at his weapon. 5 rounds left in the magazine. He had 2 spare magazines in his vest, but reloading one-handed while bleeding out was a losing gamble. He needed an advantage. He needed to cheat. He scanned the dark perimeter of the gymnasium. To his left, mounted on the wall near the equipment cage, was the heavy electrical junction box for the gymnasium's athletic equipment, specifically the motorized bleachers. Arthur slipped into the darkness of the gym, sticking to the perimeter wall. He moved with agonizing slowness, carefully placing each foot to avoid the crunch of debris. His bad leg dragged slightly, a soft, rhythmic scrape that he prayed the aliens would ignore over the heavy mechanical grinding of their own machine. He reached the junction box. It was locked with a heavy padlock. Arthur didn't have the key. He didn't have the time. He gripped his combat knife in his right hand, wedged the thick steel blade behind the lock's hasp, and twisted with brutal, desperate force. The cheap brass snapped. He opened the panel. Inside were rows of heavy, industrial circuit breakers. He found the one labeled Main Bleacher Deployment and rested his bloody thumb on the switch. He looked back at the center of the court. The three Vrel were clustered around the jammer, their mandibles clicking loudly as they forced a heavy cable into the exposed conduit. They were standing directly in front of the retracted western bleachers. Thousands of pounds of steel framing and reinforced plastic seating compressed into a flat wall against the brick. Arthur took a deep breath. He flipped the breaker. Clack. The gymnasium violently shuddered. The heavy industrial motors engaging sounded like a transport ship breaking orbit. A deafening mechanical roar filled the cavernous space as the massive western bleachers began to deploy. The three Vrel shrieked, their compound eyes snapping toward the noise. They didn't understand what they were looking at. To them, the solid wall of the room was suddenly unfolding, expanding outward like the jaws of a massive mechanical beast. The bleachers surged forward on heavy steel tracks, moving with terrifying, unstoppable momentum. The lead Vrel warrior hissed, raising its plasma repeater to fire at the advancing wall of seating. The superheated bolts scarred the plastic, but the thousands of pounds of steel framing didn't even slow down. The bleachers struck the Vrel. The impact was sickening. The heavy bottom tier of the seating caught the lead warrior squarely in the midsection, snapping its armored legs backward with a deafening crunch of breaking chitin. The alien was instantly dragged underneath the unfolding structure, its shrieks abruptly silenced by the grinding gears and heavy steel rollers. The second Vrel tried to scramble backward, its claws desperately seeking purchase on the polished hardwood floor. It wasn't fast enough. The deploying bleachers caught its massive bulk, pinning it violently against the heavy signal jammer they had just installed. The alien thrashed wildly, its blades sparking against the metal frame, but the industrial motors simply kept pushing. The pressure crushed the Vrel against its own machine, a horrific burst of green blood spraying across the basketball court as its thorax ruptured. The third Vrel, the largest of the group, managed to dive clear. It rolled across the polished wood, springing to its feet with horrifying agility. It spun toward the perimeter wall, its mandibles wide, emitting a high-pitched, vibrating roar of absolute fury. It had tracked the sound of the electrical box. It found Arthur. Arthur was leaning heavily against the brick wall. He couldn't run. He raised the carbine with his right hand, the heavy barrel wavering wildly. He pulled the trigger. Thwip, thwip, thwip. The round struck the Vrel, but his aim was compromised by the shaking of his single arm. 2 rounds sparked harmlessly off the creature's heavily armored shoulder plates. The third round caught it in the upper arm, tearing away a chunk of black chitin, but it wasn't a lethal hit. The Vrel didn't slow down. It charged. It crossed the basketball court in a terrifying blur of motion, its heavy claws gouging deep trenches into the polished wood. Arthur squeezed the trigger again. Click, click, empty. He let the carbine drop, the heavy weapon clattering uselessly against the linoleum. The Vrel was 20 feet away, closing fast. 10 feet, 5. Arthur didn't brace for impact. He didn't close his eyes. He threw his body sideways, diving toward the heavy steel equipment cage mounted against the wall. The Vrel's heavy plasma repeater swung in a brutal arc, the heavy stock catching Arthur squarely in the ribs. The impact felt like being hit by a speeding ground car. Ribs cracked with a sickening snap. Arthur was thrown through the air, crashing violently through the chain-link door of the equipment cage. He hit the concrete floor hard, surrounded by deflated dodgeballs, jump ropes, and heavy canvas mats. He couldn't breathe. His lungs seized, refusing to expand against the shattered cage of his ribs. Black spots danced aggressively in his vision. He tasted blood, thick and hot, welling up in the back of his throat. The Vrel ripped the ruined chain-link door entirely off its hinges. It stepped into the small cage, looming over Arthur. Its mandibles twitched, clicking in a rapid, rhythmic cadence that sounded almost like mocking laughter. It raised its uninjured arm, the massive, jagged claws extended to impale the old man on the floor. Arthur looked up at the monster. His vision was tunneling. He was dying. He knew what dying felt like, and this was definitely it, but he also knew what was sitting in the corner of the equipment cage, directly behind the alien's massive legs. It was a heavy, industrial floor buffer, the massive, high-torque rotary machine he used to strip the wax off the gym floor every summer. It weighed 200 pounds and ran on a direct, high-voltage line. Arthur's right hand was resting inches from the heavy yellow power cord. He didn't try to stand. He didn't try to grab his knife. He grabbed the thick yellow cord and violently yanked it upward, looping it directly around the Vrel's thick, armored ankle. The alien paused, looking down in confusion at the sudden tension on its leg. Arthur used the distraction. He rolled onto his side, reaching out with his bloody, trembling fingers, and slammed his hand onto the heavy red activation switch on the buffer's handle. The industrial floor buffer roared to life. The massive, high-torque motor engaged instantly. The heavy rotary pad spun at 3,000 revolutions per minute. But the machine wasn't resting flat on the floor. It was leaning against the wall. The sudden, violent rotation caught the concrete, instantly throwing the 200-pound machine wildly out of control. The buffer bucked violently across the floor, the heavy cord pulling tight. It whipped around the Vrel's legs, the sheer, unstoppable kinetic energy of the heavy machine sweeping the massive alien entirely off its feet. The Vrel crashed backward onto the concrete with a deafening thud. It shrieked, slashing wildly at the thick power cord tangling its limbs, but the heavy buffer was already thrashing wildly around the small cage, battering the alien's armored plates. Arthur didn't wait to see the outcome. He crawled. He dragged his broken, bleeding body out of the shattered equipment cage, leaving a thick smear of dark blood across the floor. Every movement was sheer agony. The world was spinning, a chaotic blur of grey concrete, flashing red lights, and the deafening metallic shrieks of the trapped alien. He reached the heavy metal door leading to the stairwell, the roof access. He grabbed the handle, his blood-slick fingers slipping off the metal. He wiped his hand on his pants, gripped it again, and pulled. The door opened. The stairwell was pitch black. Arthur looked back at the gymnasium. The Vrel had managed to shred the heavy power cord with its claws, killing the floor buffer. The alien was battered, covered in its own green blood, struggling to stand. Its compound eyes locked onto Arthur. It let out a horrifying, enraged hiss. "Floor's wet," Arthur wheezed, his voice a broken, bloody rasp. "Watch your step." He pulled the heavy fire door shut, the magnetic locks engaging with a solid, definitive clack. He was in the stairwell. 2 flights of concrete steps stood between him and the roof, between him and the transmission dish. Arthur leaned back against the cold steel of the door. He couldn't feel his left arm at all. His ribs were grinding together with every shallow, agonizing breath. He looked up at the dark stairs winding upward into the gloom. It looked like a mountain. It looked entirely impossible. He closed his eyes. He thought about the squeaking wheel on his mop cart. He thought about the smell of citrus spray on the whiteboards. He thought about Billy, with his untied shoelaces and missing front tooth, hiding under a desk in room 104. Arthur opened his eyes. They were hard, cold, and utterly devoid of fear. He gripped the metal handrail with his right hand, dug his boots into the concrete, and began to climb, one brutal, agonizing step at a time. The janitor was going to the roof. The concrete stairwell felt like the inside of a forgotten tomb. It smelled of old dust, damp cinder blocks, and the sharp, metallic tang of rusted iron. Arthur dragged his right boot up to the next step, ignoring the sickening scrape of his synthetic joint grinding against the concrete. His chest heaved violently. Each breath was a shallow, ragged gasp that sent hot spikes of agony radiating from his fractured ribs straight into his jaw. The darkness was absolute, heavy and suffocating. He navigated strictly by the cold iron handrail and the terrifying, rhythmic thud of his own failing heart echoing in his ears. He stopped on the first landing, his forehead pressed against the freezing, painted brick wall. Blood dripped steadily from his torn shoulder, pooling quietly in the dark. It was a miserable, agonizing process. He wasn't a hero storming a fortress. He was an exhausted, cynical old man dragging a ruined body up a hill he desperately didn't want to climb. From below, a massive crash shook the structural foundation of the stairwell. The heavy fire door buckled and gave way. The Vrel from the gymnasium had broken through the magnetic locks. A low, terrifying hiss echoed up the concrete shaft, amplified by the enclosed space until it sounded like a dozen predators. The hunter was coming. Arthur didn't look down. He couldn't afford the psychological toll of seeing those compound eyes in the dark. He just took another step. His fingers cramped painfully around the metal rail. His vision swam with floating black spots and sudden flashes of crimson. The temperature dropped sharply as he neared the top landing. Cold, bitter air slipped under the heavy steel of the roof access door, smelling heavily of ozone, sulfur, and freezing rain. Arthur reached the final step. His knees finally gave out entirely. He collapsed hard against the metal door, his shoulder slamming into the push bar, leaving a thick, wet smear of dark blood on the grey surface. He lay there for a second, his scarred cheek pressed to the freezing steel, listening to the heavy, rapid scraping of clawed feet ascending the stairs directly below him. 2 floors down, maybe 1. Time was gone, replaced only by adrenaline and pain. He reached up, grasping the heavy push bar with his right hand, his knuckles turning stark white. He threw his remaining body weight forward. The heavy latch clicked, and the steel door slammed open against the brutal wind. The storm hit him instantly, an unforgiving wall of atmospheric pressure. Freezing, driving rain lashed across his face like tiny glass shards, instantly soaking his gray hair and washing the sweat and alien blood down into his eyes. New Providence was in the middle of an aggressive monsoon cycle. The sky was an ugly, bruised purple, completely devoid of starlight or hope. The roof was a vast, flat expanse of black tar and crushed gravel, dotted with humming HFY Sci units. In the absolute center, 30 yards away, stood the primary communications dish. It was a massive, old-school analog transmitter pointing blindly toward the dark, churning clouds. Arthur stumbled out onto the wet gravel. The wind howled furiously, a deafening, continuous roar that swallowed the pathetic sound of his own ragged breathing. The rain was freezing, instantly numbing his torn shoulder and soaking through the heavy trauma plates of his tactical vest. It was a small mercy against the burning pain in his ribs. He limped toward the dish, his bad leg dragging heavily through the deep black puddles forming rapidly on the uneven tar. 10 yards, 20. He reached the base of the massive antenna structure. The manual override panel was locked tightly behind a heavy weatherized cage. Arthur didn't have his maintenance keys. He had left them dangling on the yellow mop cart in the C-block hallway. A bitter, exhausted laugh escaped his throat, sounding more like a dry cough. "Figures," he wheezed. The wind instantly snatched the word from his bleeding lips. He drew his heavy combat knife with trembling, numb fingers. The serrated blade was dulled and chipped from carving through alien chitin, but it was still a thick wedge of solid steel. He jammed the blade deep into the heavy padlock securing the cage, wedged his wet boot against the metal housing for leverage, and violently twisted his wrist. The steel groaned in protest. The rusted internal pins gave way with a sharp, definitive snap. Arthur ripped the ruined lock off and threw open the metal cage. The control panel inside was ancient, dominated by heavy toggle switches and a massive manual transmission lever. It was beautifully, stubbornly analog. Behind him, the roof access door exploded outward. The heavy steel panel tore completely off its reinforced hinges, clattering wildly across the gravel roof. The massive, frail warrior stepped out into the storm. It was a horrific, nightmarish sight. The creature was badly battered, its black carapace cracked and oozing thick green fluid that washed away down its legs in the heavy rain. Its lower left leg dragged completely uselessly, crushed by the industrial floor buffer, but its mandibles were flared wide in absolute primal fury. It saw the hunched, bleeding figure standing at the antenna panel. It let out a deafening metallic shriek that pierced straight through the howl of the storm, vibrating the water in the puddles. Arthur didn't turn around. He heard the shriek. He felt the heavy, thudding vibration of the alien's enraged charge through the wet gravel. He just kept working. He slammed his bloody palm against the primary power toggle. The heavy backup generator at the base of the dish whined, coughing to life with a thick puff of black exhaust that blew sideways in the wind. The manual tracking screen flickered to life, casting a sickly green glow across Arthur's exhausted, pale face. He grabbed the heavy manual alignment wheel with his good hand. He had to point the massive dish directly at the orbital relay coordinates. It wasn't an automated system. He had to physically dial it in exactly. The Vrel closed the distance. 20 yards. 10. The massive alien raised its heavy, bladed forelimb, preparing to violently skewer the frail human against the metal control panel. Arthur spun the rusted wheel, 140 degrees north, 45 degrees elevation. The heavy steel gears inside the dish ground loudly, fighting the wind resistance as the massive concave structure tilted upward toward the bruised, chaotic sky. The alignment lock clicked solidly into place. Arthur smashed his bloodied fist down onto the heavy red transmission button. A loud high-frequency hum vibrated through the metal housing, shaking the tar under his boots. The encrypted distress signal was out. The Terran Coalition cavalry was finally being called, but Arthur was completely out of time. He turned just as the enraged Vrel lunged. The massive, jagged blade sliced downward through the driving rain. Arthur didn't try to dodge. His body was completely spent, his muscles refusing to fire. Instead, he lunged forward, stepping directly inside the arc of the brutal swing. The alien's blade completely missed his head, burying itself deep into the heavy metal housing of the control panel with a blinding shower of electrical sparks. Arthur drove his combat knife straight up, burying it to the hilt into the soft, unarmored joint directly beneath the creature's primary shoulder. Hot, foul-smelling green blood spilled over his hand, The Vrel shrieked, a chaotic, gurgling sound of agony. It ripped its trapped arm backward, violently tearing the knife from Arthur's weak grasp and sending the old man flying backward through the air. Arthur hit the wet gravel hard. The sheer impact knocked the last remaining breath from his crushed lungs. He slid across the rough tar, coming to a halt near the very edge of the roof. He couldn't move. The catastrophic pain in his ribs and shoulder finally overwhelmed his central nervous system. His vision went completely grey, fading to absolute black at the edges. He lay flat on his back, staring blankly up at the freezing rain falling from the dark, unforgiving sky. The massive alien staggered toward him. It was dying, bleeding out rapidly into the puddles, but its stubborn hatred kept it moving forward. It dragged its crushed leg, looming over Arthur. It raised its remaining blade, ready to execute the old man on the wet tar. Arthur didn't close his eyes. He felt a strange, detached sense of peace wash over him. He had hit the button. The signal was out. The terrified kids huddled in the dark classrooms were going to be entirely fine. His long, exhausting shift was finally over. A deafening sonic boom ruptured the sky overhead. The heavy grey clouds physically tore apart. A Terran coalition dropship descended through the raging storm like an angry mechanical god. Its heavy impulse engines scorched the freezing rain into massive clouds of thick white steam. The dropship didn't even bother to land on the roof. The side deployment doors blew open while it was still hovering 50 feet above the deck. 4 heavy shock troopers dropped straight from the bay. They hit the gravel roof with bone-shattering force, heavy depleted uranium rounds immediately tearing through the rain. The alien was violently ripped apart in a chaotic storm of hypervelocity lead, its massive body collapsing onto the tar. The lead shock trooper looked down, his heavy helmet retracted, revealing a scarred, severe face. He looked at the grey-haired man bleeding out in a faded, soaked blue custodial jumpsuit. The trooper saw the faded coalition infantry tattoo on Arthur's forearm, washed clean by the rain. The trooper instantly dropped to one knee. "Medical Protocol Omega," he barked into his comms. He looked down at Arthur, his voice full of reverence. "Hold on, Sergeant. The line is completely secure." Arthur coughed, tasting cold rain and blood. He looked up at the young soldier. "Don't call me Sergeant," Arthur whispered, his eyes finally sliding shut as the combat medics rushed down from the sky. "I'm just the janitor, and somebody needs to wipe down the cafeteria tables." The heavy darkness finally took him, pulling him away into a deep, dreamless sleep. The galaxy learned a harsh, unforgettable lesson that day. You never attack a human school, not because of their reinforced walls or planetary defenses, but because of the ghosts they employ to sweep their floors. If this gritty, boots-on-the-ground HFY story got your adrenaline pumping, hit that like button to honor the quiet veterans still fighting the good fight in the shadows. Share this video with a fellow sci-fi fan who knows that the deadliest warriors in the universe often wear the most ordinary, unassuming uniforms. Subscribe and ring the bell for more epic, heavy metal human survival stories dropping every week. Drop your thoughts in the comments below.